First comment gets a shout out in the next video.
Department of Justice released its latest and likely last major batch of files related to investigations into the late convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. This comes more than a month after the DOJ missed a deadline set by Congress and signed into law by President Trump. It includes more than 3 million pages, 2,000 videos, and 180,000 images. The DOJ says there are redactions, including the personally identifiable information of victims, but the department has not provided a full explanation of what's excluded. The Deputy Attorney General said the White House did not have oversight over the review or redactions.
Before we dive in, make sure you like, comment, share, and subscribe. And hit the notification bell so you never miss a Crime Decoder breakdown. Nobody expected it to land like this. In late January 2026, the United States Department of Justice released a gargantuan trove of files, millions of pages of documents, hundreds of thousands of images, and thousands of videos connected to one of the darkest figures of the 21st century, Jeffrey Epstein. This wasn't a leak. It was a sanctioned release, forced by law, mandated after years of public pressure and congressional oversight. For the first time, ordinary people could see what the government had been quietly holding behind closed doors. Epstein, a man whose name had become synonymous with secrecy, power, and exploitation, had been dead for nearly 7 years. He died by suicide in a federal jail cell in 2019 while awaiting trial on federal sex trafficking charges. Yet in death, his shadow stretched even longer, shrouded in unanswered questions and unexamined connections. The files dumped online weren't neatly organized. They were a forest of raw intelligence: emails, agent reports, flight logs, hotel receipts, photographs, coded itineraries, and witness statements. Some were heavily redacted to protect victims. Others were mistakenly released with no censorship at all, exposing names and faces that had never been public. Almost immediately, investigators, journalists, and online sleuths began parsing through the material. What emerged was stark and unsettling. Epstein's circle was far broader and more interconnected than most had ever imagined. What had once been whispered in tabloids and conspiracy forums was suddenly stamped in official documents. People from politics, finance, diplomacy, entertainment, their names surfaced, sometimes in mundane emails, sometimes in cryptic references. And yet, resurfacing doesn't prove guilt. It only proves presence. Among the noise and speculation, one name shot to the spotlight in the first hours of the release: Ghislaine Maxwell, Epstein's closest associate and convicted trafficker. Already serving a lengthy federal sentence, she appeared again in the files, invoking her Fifth Amendment rights when pressed before Congress, choosing silence over revelation. Her refusal deepened the mystery. What truths did she carry that were still locked away? At the same time, another unexpected name began circulating across social media and news feeds. Tony Hawk, the legendary skateboarder, was mentioned in association with a rumor that his wedding had taken place on Epstein's infamous private island. Hawk publicly denounced the claim, labeling it misinformation and clarifying that the event in question occurred on a totally different island decades earlier. But the public's imagination had already been sparked. If a beloved celebrity's name could appear in these files, even through misinterpretation, then what lay buried deeper in the mountain of raw document data? And then, a series of new revelations began to surface from lawmakers who had reviewed unredacted versions of the same files. The world was just seeing in redacted form names that had been hidden, connections that had been coded in black ink, relationships that may never have seen the light of day, until now. What they found next wasn't just mysterious. It was explosive. If you're on the edge of your seat, hit that like, comment your theory, and subscribe to enable us tell you more hidden truths. When lawmakers were granted access to the unredacted Epstein files, the difference between what the public saw and what officials reviewed became painfully clear. The public version was layered in black ink, names blocked out, locations hidden, identifying details stripped away. But behind closed doors, Some members of Congress claim they saw far more than the average citizen ever would. According to officials who spoke publicly after reviewing the material, the unredacted documents included additional flight logs, contact lists, financial records, and internal investigative memos. None of this automatically proved criminal wrongdoing for those named, and that distinction is critical. Being listed in an address book or flight record does not equate to guilt, but the presence of powerful individuals inside official evidence files was enough to reignite years of suspicion. Epstein's network had always been the most disturbing part of the case. He was not a lone predator operating in isolation. He cultivated relationships with billionaires, academics, royalty, politicians, scientists, celebrities, people who moved comfortably in the highest tiers of society. That proximity to power is what shielded him for years. Now, with millions of documents released, patterns began emerging again. Flight manifests from Epstein's private jet, often referred to as the Lolita Express, resurfaced in sharper detail. Travel dates, passenger lists, destinations including New York, Palm Beach, Paris, New Mexico, and his private island in the U.S. Virgin Islands. These logs had been discussed before in earlier court proceedings, but the 2026 release consolidated them in a way that allowed the public to cross-reference names more easily than ever. Investigative notes also revealed how federal agents tracked Epstein's financial transactions, shell companies, property transfers, payments that prosecutors had previously described as part of a sex trafficking enterprise. While much of this had already been presented during Ghislaine Maxwell's 2021 trial, which resulted in her conviction and 20-year federal sentence, the new files showed just how expansive the paper trail truly was. Maxwell's continued silence only amplified the tension. During her recent congressional appearance, she invoked the Fifth Amendment repeatedly when questioned about Epstein's clients and associates. Legally, that is her right, but publicly, it fueled speculation. Survivors and advocacy groups expressed frustration, arguing that the full truth about who benefited from Epstein's crimes may never be publicly known. And then came another unsettling detail. Some lawmakers hinted that the files included references to individuals who had not previously been connected to Epstein in media coverage. These claims were carefully worded. No sweeping accusations, no dramatic indictments, just a quiet but deliberate suggestion that the public story might still be incomplete. Online investigators immediately went to work. Social media filled with theories, some grounded in document analysis, others spiraling into speculation. The line between fact and rumor began to blur, and that blurring became dangerous. Because in a case like this, misinformation spreads just as fast as truth. But buried in the noise were 8 specific revelations that stood out. Not conspiracy, not guesswork. Documented findings pulled directly from the release. And the first of those revelations didn't involve a new name. It involved something far more unsettling. Evidence that authorities may have had stronger leverage against Epstein's network years before his arrest, and didn't act. That's where we're heading next. If you're following closely, hit like right now. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read them all. Share this video with someone who wants facts, not rumors, and make sure you're subscribed to Crime Decoder. The next chapter gets darker. One of the most unsettling revelations in the 2026 file release wasn't a new celebrity name. It wasn't a hidden island guest. It was something quieter, and in many ways more disturbing. Internal memos showed that federal authorities had gathered significant intelligence on Jeffrey Epstein years before his final 2019 arrest. Investigative notes, interview summaries, and financial tracking reports indicated that law enforcement had built pieces of a case long before the public realized how deep the operation ran. This wasn't entirely unknown. Back in 2008, Epstein secured a controversial non-prosecution agreement in Florida after facing state-level charges involving minors. That deal allowed him to plead guilty to lesser offenses, serve a short jail sentence with work release privileges, and avoid federal prosecution at the time. It sparked outrage once details became public years later. But the newly released documents painted a sharper picture of just how much information was circulating internally. There were victim statements describing recruitment tactics. There were notes outlining how young girls were allegedly approached, groomed, and transported. There were financial records showing structured payments that prosecutors would later argue were part of a trafficking system. There were references to associates helping coordinate schedules and travel. And yet, despite early red flags, Epstein continued operating in elite circles for years. The files suggest that jurisdictional conflicts, evidentiary hurdles, and the 2008 plea agreement complicated federal action for a long time. That doesn't imply corruption by default. Complex cases often stall for legal reasons. But what unsettled many observers was the sense that momentum existed, and then slowed. When Epstein was finally arrested in July 2019 on federal sex trafficking charges, prosecutors described a long-running scheme involving underage girls in New York and Florida. He pleaded not guilty. 1 month later, he was found dead in his Manhattan jail cell. The medical examiner ruled it a suicide. His death ended the possibility of a federal trial. And that's where the frustration lives. Because without a trial, evidence that would have been presented publicly, witness testimony, financial documentation, cross-examinations, never unfolded in open court. Instead, much of that material remained sealed until pressure mounted for broader transparency. The 2026 release was supposed to answer lingering questions. Instead, in some ways, it intensified them. Investigators reviewing the files noticed how certain names appeared repeatedly in contact books and scheduling notes. Again, presence does not equal participation, but repetition suggests familiarity, and familiarity raises uncomfortable questions about who knew what and when. Advocacy groups for survivors have emphasized one thing consistently: the focus should remain on victims. The documents detail patterns of exploitation, manipulation, and power imbalance that went on for years. That's not speculation. That's part of court records and sworn testimony. Still, one of the 8 key revelations stood out among lawmakers reviewing the unredacted files: references to potential digital evidence that had not been widely discussed before. Devices, hard drives, backup storage. Material that may have documented far more than anyone realized. And if that evidence exists in full, what does it actually show? That's where we're going next. If you're still with me, comment your thoughts below. Do you believe the full truth is out, or are we only seeing part of the picture? Like, share, and subscribe, because the next chapter may be the most unsettling yet. If you've made it this far, you already understand something. This case isn't just about people. It's about records, trails, data, the kind that doesn't forget. Among the most talked about elements in the 2026 document release were references to digital evidence seized during federal raids on Epstein's properties in 2019. When agents searched his Manhattan townhouse and other residences, they reportedly collected computers, external hard drives, storage devices, CDs, and encrypted materials. At the time, prosecutors confirmed the seizure but released few specifics about the contents. Now, years later, internal inventory logs and evidence tracking sheets included in the DOJ release confirmed just how extensive that digital haul was. The documents didn't publicly reveal explicit content. They did not publish illegal material, but they did confirm categories of evidence: labeled folders, coded file names, storage volumes measured in terabytes. Investigators cataloged images and videos. They noted organized systems of archiving, structured labeling. That level of organization disturbed many observers. It suggested documentation, not randomness. Again, it is critical to remain factual. The released summaries do not state that every item involved criminal conduct. Digital evidence in any case can contain legal and illegal material mixed together. But prosecutors in 2019 had already alleged that Epstein maintained photographic evidence of underage girls in his residence. That claim was part of federal court filings. The 2026 release reinforced that such materials were central to the investigation. What remains unknown is whether that digital evidence implicated others beyond Epstein and Maxwell. Some lawmakers reviewing unredacted versions hinted that the evidence could have investigative significance beyond what has been publicly disclosed. They did not provide names. They did not describe specific acts, but they suggested the scope was wider than a single defendant. That suggestion alone reignited public speculation. Legal experts have pointed out a harsh reality. Possession of evidence does not automatically translate into prosecutable cases against additional individuals. Evidence must meet specific standards. Context matters. Intent matters. Victim testimony matters. Without those elements aligning, prosecutors may be unable to move forward. Still, survivors' advocates argue that transparency is essential. They maintain that victims deserve to know the full extent of who participated, who facilitated, and who ignored warning signs. Meanwhile, misinformation continued spreading online. Fabricated lists circulated. Edited screenshots went viral. Innocent people were falsely accused simply for appearing in social or professional contact records. The chaos made one thing clear. The difference between verified evidence and internet rumor had never been more important. And yet, amid all the noise, one final revelation from the files shifted attention back to the core of the case. Not a celebrity, not a politician, but the structure of the operation itself, how recruitment allegedly functioned, how victims were cycled, and how power insulated the system. The mechanics of exploitation. That final piece forces a harder question than any list of names ever could. How did this continue for so long? We answer that in the final chapter. If you're still here, you care about the truth. So hit like, drop your thoughts below, and share this video. Make sure you're subscribed to Crime Decoder because the conclusion pulls everything together. When the final wave of analysis from the 2026 file release settled, one truth stood above everything else. Jeffrey Epstein did not operate in chaos. He operated in structure. The documents reinforced what prosecutors argued years earlier, that Epstein's crimes were not random acts of misconduct. They were part of a system. Recruitment patterns appeared consistent. According to court records and victim testimony presented during Ghislaine Maxwell's 2021 trial, young girls were often approached through intermediaries. Some were told they would earn money for massages. Some were brought into environments that felt glamorous at first: private jets, luxury homes, wealthy guests. Over time, those environments allegedly shifted into coercion and abuse. Maxwell was convicted in federal court for her role in facilitating that recruitment. She is currently serving a 20-year sentence. Epstein, facing federal charges in 2019, never stood trial due to his death, which the medical examiner ruled a suicide. The newly released files did not overturn those outcomes. They did not produce sweeping new indictments. They did not confirm every rumor that has circulated online for years. But they did clarify something deeper. They showed how influence can delay accountability, how money can complicate investigations, how jurisdictional issues, plea agreements, and legal technicalities can slow momentum. None of that proves a grand conspiracy, but it does reveal how fragile justice can become when power and vulnerability collide. One of the 8 key revelations centered on how long certain warning signs existed in investigative channels before decisive federal action occurred. The paper trail shows intelligence moving through offices, discussions between agencies, and years of fragmented progress. Whether those delays were procedural, political, or simply the result of complex case building remains debated. What's not debated is that victims lived through those years in silence. Survivors have consistently said the same thing. The focus should not drift toward celebrity speculation. It should remain on exploitation, accountability, and prevention. The documents detail harm, to real people. And perhaps that is the most haunting takeaway. The public often searches for a dramatic final twist, a hidden list, a shocking confession, a cinematic courtroom ending. But this case ends in something far less satisfying. One central figure dead before trial. One accomplice convicted. Countless questions that may never receive definitive public answers. The 2026 release pulled back another layer of the curtain. It exposed the scale of documentation. It reminded the world how interconnected power structures can be, and it forced a renewed conversation about transparency and justice. But here, the question that lingers long after the headlines fade. If a system like this could operate in plain sight once, could it happen again? Let me know what you think in the comments. Do you believe the full truth is finally out, or are there still pieces missing? Like this video if you value fact-based deep dives. Share it with someone who wants clarity over chaos. And subscribe to Crime Decoder for more stories that demand scrutiny. Because sometimes the most disturbing crimes aren't hidden in darkness. They're protected by it.